So what we're going to do for the next period, about 25 minutes or so, is look primarily at three things. First of all, the background, how we got to where we are in terms of the standing of the parties. Then secondly, exactly where are we right now, the current polling situation, and they'll look at what both the UK and Welsh Polls are currently saying, also give you just a little bit of new data that hasn't been seen before. And then thirdly, be looking at, well, what are the implications of this for the electoral battleground for all of the major parties, and you know, what plausibly could their expectations be for this forthcoming election. So the background, I think as ever in Wales, we have to start with the defining reality of electoral politics in Wales for an awfully long time, which has been that of Labour Party dominance. The last 19 general elections in a row, the Labour Party in Wales have won more votes than any other party and an absolute majority of all of the seats. I'd be a very brave person who would expect anything other than number 20 to happen this May. In 2010, faced with a very difficult electoral environment, the Labour Party's dominance was certainly challenged. The fortress was shaken but not completely overturned. This was the result in Wales. The Labour Party, yes, did see its vote share fall quite considerably. On that, in 2005, it lost some seats, but still winning 2/3, more or less, of the seats in Wales. Even though at 36.2%, this was actually Labour's lowest vote share in a general election in Wales since 1918, lower even than they'd done under Michael Foot in 1983. And in fact, in 1918, Labour wasn't even standing candidates everywhere. So in reality, this was Labour's worst vote share in a general election ever, really. Yet, they're still some way ahead of any of the other parties, still winning 2/3 of the seats. The other things we see, obviously, a pretty good election by their historic standards for the Welsh Conservatives. The Liberal Democrats, rather strangely, gaining votes but losing a seat due to the peculiar political magic of Len Topic, and Plaid Cymru continuing their electoral drift, which pretty much characterised the whole of the first decade of this century. So what's happened since then? Well, we've seen obviously a number of major electoral tests since 2010. The Assembly election of 2011, they're no longer encumbered by association with an unpopular Westminster government. Welsh Labour Party did extremely well, their best ever devolved election. It's also the best ever devolved election, of course, for the Welsh Conservatives, while the Welsh Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru had their worst ever Assembly election. 2012, of course, we had local elections, except for viewers in this morning. Again, another very strong performance by the Labour Party, all of the other main established parties, to a greater or less extent, falling back somewhat. Although a year later in Ynys actually we saw something slightly different, and actually Plaid Cymru doing rather well there. 2014 European election was, of course, interesting. We see Labour once again coming first, as they had failed to do in 2009. But Labour coming first in terms of vote share, but by much less than many people had expected. The other major shock, of course, was the big breakthrough for UKIP in Wales. The other major thing I'd point to from the European election, I think, was not noticed very widely last year. Wales was, actually by some distance, the Liberal Democrats' worst performance of any of the regions in Britain. They got 3.9% of the vote in Wales. On a very difficult night in the rest of Britain, everywhere else they got at least more than 5% of the vote. So a very difficult night for the Welsh Lib Dems. Also then, I've just got a couple of nice pretty slides to show you on. These are the major trends in the opinion polls. This one is a thing which literally charts every single opinion poll conducted on a GB-wide basis from 2010 until about a week ago. The little dots are each individual poll, the broader lines are kind of smooth averages, and we see there the basic story of this Parliament. So Labour recovering fairly rapidly in the year after the general election, Conservatives remaining fairly close to them, though, until there's basically the omni-shambles budget of March 2012, and then falling away. Labour then having a fairly substantial lead for much of the time, but that's gradually diminished far more because of Labour's vote slipping and because of the Conservatives' vote actually rising. We also see, of course, the Liberal Democrats' vote almost falling off the edge of a cliff there, then staying pretty much around about 10% consistently until the last year, when their support has actually corroded further to an average now of about 7 to 8%. The other major thing, of course, we see on the slide here is oh, sorry, not meant to see that yet, is the rise of UKIP to a peak there, to peak around the European elections, and then possibly a slight, but only slight, decline this year. And more recently, the rise of the Greens. In Wales, we don't have quite as many polls. We can't do one of these wonderful smooth average things. This is literally all of them we've had since 2012, but they are at least more frequent than they used to be. I think the major thing here is during 2012, obviously Labour was doing fantastically well, at or above 50% in every one of the 4 polls conducted that year. We then saw slowly through 2013 and 2014 Labour's vote slipping to a point whereby about the end of last year, Labour was actually down to the same level of support, the same vote share, about 36%, that they'd won in Wales at the last general election. But in 3 polls conducted this year, there have been some signs that at the very least that erosion of Labour support has been stemmed, maybe even marginally reversed. Conservatives have been, I think, quite impressively robust at a level of support in the low to mid-20s, only just below their level of support in the last general election. The Liberal Democrats, of course, by the time these regular polls started, had already kind of lost a lot of their support. In the last year or so, if anything, the position has been worsening for them, not getting better. And of course, we see UKIP improving during last year, to, by the end of the year, polling around 18% in a couple of polls, although there's at least some slight suggestions in a couple of polls this year that UKIP support may have slipped. And Plaid Cymru have been remaining most of the time fairly consistent at or just above 10% in the Welsh polls. So that's been kind of the long-term trend. Where exactly are we now then? Second major thing I want to discuss. So where are the polls now? So we look at the UK polls, the most recent Welsh poll. We also want to look at a couple of other bits of evidence. First of all, the Ashcroft constituency polls that have been done over the last few months, funded by Lord Ashcroft, with a spare few $100,000 he found on the back of the sofa. And also, finally, we're going to give you a little bit of new evidence, stuff from the latest Welsh political barometer that was held back. So you are going to be, today, the first people to see this evidence. So don't say we never think of you. On a couple of matters. First of all, the standing of the party leaders in Wales. We're going to be seeing an awful lot of these people the next few weeks, so what do people think of them now? And then secondly, well, what impact, if any, has campaigning had so far? So first of all, the current UK polls. This is last night's May2015.com poll of polls, which is basically a weighted average of the polls over the last 5 days. That's where things stand at the moment, with indication of changes on vote shares in Britain, not the UK, GB vote shares in Britain in 2010. So Labour at the moment have a slight lead. The polls have been bobbing backward and forward, slight leads to the Conservatives, slight leads for Labour in the last few weeks. There's another one from Populist due in about an hour and a half, so perhaps that'll put Conservatives back ahead. But polls the last few days have had Labour just a little bit ahead, and improving slightly more than 4 percentage points on their performance in the last general election. Conservatives just behind them. The Liberal Democrats losing around about 2/3 of their support from 2010. Also UKIP making a big advance, and the Greens also making a significant advance. The most recent poll in Wales was the Welsh Political Barometer, published exactly 2 weeks ago today. little taste, well, just to tease you, by the way, there should be another one along about this time next week. But the most recent Welsh Political Barometer poll, we see there. So Labour on 39, their best share for a few months, putting them about 3 points up on where they were in 2010. The Conservatives and Plaid Cymru just marginally below their performance in the last general election. But the Liberal Democrats in Wales losing not 2/3 of their support from 2010, but 3/4 of their support from 2010. Obviously, we also see significant rises again for UKIP and for the Greens. And if we project that in terms of just uniform national swing, that sees Plaid and the Conservatives net staying on the same number of seats as last time, Labour making 2 gains, the Liberal Democrats making 2 losses. We'll look later exactly which seats those are. Right. Lord Ashcroft's polls have been a very interesting and, something like me, very welcome innovation in this Parliament. We've had for the first time ever a fairly large number of full-scale, full sample polls conducted in individual constituencies. Many of them obviously conducted concentrating on the marginal seats. No one's particularly going to be wanting to poll a constituency where everyone knows who's going to win. 5 of them have been conducted in Wales, or rather 5 seats have been polled in Wales. Cardiff North, where I live, us lucky people have actually been polled twice, both in April and July last year. We then had Cardiff Central in September, Brecon and Radnor in November, Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire at the end of last year, and then early this year we've had the Vale of Glamorgan polls. One of the interesting innovations of Lord Ashcroft's polls has been not just actually doing large numbers of constituency polls, but the way in which he's done them. He's asked in his polls, first of all, the standard, how would you vote if there was a general election tomorrow question, the standard voting intention question, but then followed that up with something that was trying to prod people to think about their specific constituencies. Thinking about your constituency, the people who are likely to stand there, how would you vote in your constituency? And you do sometimes see rather different results in that constituency-specific question. This following slide, which those of you in the back may just strain a little bit to see, you could maybe turn around actually and look at the screen at the back. This summarises the results from the constituency question for all 5 seats. I've taken the more recent poll for Cardiff North. But basically, what he's shown there, for both Cardiff North and Cardiff Central, he's shown Labour well ahead by 11 points in Cardiff North, by 12 points in Cardiff Central. Brecon and Radnor was extremely close. The Liberal Democrats just ahead of the Conservatives. Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire similarly close. The Conservatives just ahead of Labour. And the Vale of Glamorgan recently showing Conservatives just slightly further ahead, 6 points ahead of the Labour Party there. And if we're looking for patterns in these things, it's interesting, to me at least, that the Conservatives actually are down by minimum of 4 percentage points in all of these polls, even the ones where they're leading. A couple of other things to point out. People talk about the Liberal Democrats maybe doing better in their core seats. Well, we do see some evidence of that from Lord Ashcroft here. In the seats where they're not competitive here, Cardiff North, Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire, Vale of Glamorgan, they're losing about 3/4 of their 2010 vote. In Cardiff Central, they're only losing a mere 2/5, and in Brecon and Radnor, a mere 1/3. If you're losing 3/4 of your support nationally, doing better is maybe a relative thing. A couple of other points, I think maybe what I'm a bit puzzled about, as I mentioned on the blog, is none of these seats Plaid Cymru targets, yet they're all up several percentage points in all of them, despite not making similar progress in the national polls. I'm not quite sure what that's about. The final point, UKIP obviously are up in all of these polls, as we would broadly expect. Though the most recent one in Vale of Glamorgan was possibly rather disappointing for them, given that the Vale of Glamorgan local authority, which is slightly different boundaries to the constituency, was one that UKIP actually won in the European elections last year. It was therefore a bit surprising to see UKIP only in 4th place in the constituency in that recent Lord Ashcroft poll. Finally, for this section, a little bit of new data for you. A couple of things we asked in the most recent Welsh Political Barometer poll. One was just we repeated a standard question that's been used in a number of YouGov polls in Wales and polls elsewhere about the party leaders. They're going to be front and centre of their party's campaigns the next few weeks, so what do people think of them? This is a basic question people asked to rank the leaders on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is strongly dislike, 10 is strongly like. We asked it for all of the main UK and Welsh party leaders, including, for the first time ever, Natalie Bennett and Pippa Bartolotti of the Greens. And there's a couple of bits of this information I'd like to show you. First of all, we asked people to rank it on a 0 to 10 scale. They're also given a don't know option. Now, a few people might say don't know because they are genuinely, even after all these years, say undecided about what they think about David Cameron or Ed Miliband. But in the aggregate, the percentage of people that say don't know seems to function as a pretty good indicator of sort of the visibility, or conversely, the anonymity of a party leader. So this first bit is the percentage of people who just said don't know for each leader. And they appropriately colour-coded here. What we see is fewer than 10% of people saying don't know about Cameron, Miliband, Clegg or Farage. Natalie Bennett, probably unsurprisingly, is much more anonymous, and more than half of people said don't know about her. When we contrast the leaders in the Assembly with those at Westminster, again, this is a sort of finding we've found before. All of the leaders in the Assembly are much more anonymous than those at Westminster, even Carwyn Jones after several years as First Minister, although Carwyn is much better known than any of the 3 opposition leaders. And unsurprisingly, I suppose, nearly 3/4 of people didn't have a view about Pippa Bartolotti. The second thing I want to look at is then, of those who actually had a view, what did they think? Well, this next table gives you the averages out of 10, as well as changes since we last asked the question in a poll conducted in June last year. Now, one or two things to note here. First of all, nobody averages more than 5 out of 10. So, politicians in unpopularity shock. What else is there to note? Well, none of the Westminster leaders averages more than 4. Of those, actually Ed Miliband is the most popular, average of 4.0. Nick Clegg, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the least popular. But when we look at changes since the last poll, actually Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg have both improved their position a bit. David Cameron has not improved his position at all, unlike Clegg and Miliband. Nigel Farage has actually very marginally slipped. But the interesting thing to look at Nigel Farage is that amongst UKIP supporters, he polls, perhaps unsurprisingly, very strongly, lots of 8s, 9s and 10s out of 10. But amongst everyone else, there's increasing numbers of people who are giving him a 0, who's actually scored highest in where you don't want to score, which is the percentage of people giving a 0 out of 10, really strongly dislike. He scored more 0s out of 10 than what's going on there than anyone else. Well, anyway, so his average was 3.4, but opinions about him seem to be sort of moving to both extremes, and there's increasing numbers of people who really dislike Nigel Farage in Wales. Just the other things about kind of eventual Welsh leaders. Labour continue UP to have the most popular leader in Wales, both at Westminster and at the Welsh level. And Carwyn Jones continues to be the most popular party leader of any description within Wales, but by some little way. Of the others, we continue to see both Kirsty Williams and Leanne Wood both improving their position and being sort of roughly in about second place. So kind of that's roughly where the leaders stand. It would be interesting to see, for instance, particularly on visibility, but also popularity, whether her participation in the debates has a significant effect on the ratings of Leanne Wood, as one would expect it might well do. Secondly, we also asked a little bit about campaigns, albeit it yielded a relatively predictable result. Has anyone from the parties contacted you about the general election? And 80% of people said no. Well, this was early March, so perhaps not terribly surprising. And most of them, unlike me, don't live in Cardiff North, where you get people contacting you incessantly. Just under 20% of people said yes. Of those who said yes, which party had contacted them? Well, Labour was ahead with the Conservatives in second, Lib Dems and Plaid a bit further behind, and then UKIP and the Greens further behind still. This partly reflects something I'll come to talk about in a minute, which is, I think, maybe the extent to which some parties and not others are fighting across a broader and more narrow front in the election. The electoral battleground for Lib Dems and Plaid in particular, I think, is noticeably narrower, focused on a narrower range of seats than it is, say, for the Conservatives and particularly Labour. Right. Final thing just on this, well, which parties run the most effective campaign? A landslide for the don't knows, or the none of them's here at the moment. Amongst those with a view, Labour were marginally ahead, but it'll be interesting to maybe try run this question again in a few weeks' time, see if that has changed. Right. What I want to talk about for the remaining 10 minutes or so is the electoral battleground then. So what does all of this, in terms of polling, the standing of the parties, actually mean for when an election is really won and lost in the specific constituencies? And the way we've kind of organised this is to divide the seats up into four main types for each of the parties. So, those seats they hold and they don't hold, and those seats then which are broadly likely to be uncompetitive, or where they're competitive. For a party that has a seat, these are the sort of the ones they want, safe seats, they hold them and they're not really facing any serious competition. But these ones, if you at least recognise them, maybe are also useful for a party. Recognise seats where you don't hold it and you have no chance at all, hopeless seats. And then I suppose where more of the action is, the seats where parties are having to mount an active defence, and those which they are actively targeting, seeking to gain. So we've tried, and I'm sure there will be some arguments about how we've drawn the boundaries there, we've tried to classify for each of the parties that currently hold seats where their seats stand in relation to this categorisation, and I'm not sure even Richard and I completely agree on these, but anyway, this is what we've done. So first of all, for Labour. Labour has quite a number of seats, I think, which we could expect to be safe. Not all of them on paper look safe. So let's look at, say, Swansea West. On paper, that's a marginal, a majority from last time of fewer than 1,000 votes. But it was the Liberal Democrats who were pressing their hard last time. I think everyone expects that the Liberal Democrats are going to fall back considerably, so we would expect that to be safe. Indeed, of the 26 seats that Labour hold, I think we would expect probably 24 of them, at least, to be reasonably safe. The two that, well, one of them I think we would expect to be pretty competitive. I've colour-coded which parties are challenging here. So Ynys Môn, everything we know about Ynys Môn politics in recent years suggests that Plaid Cymru are likely to challenge Labour pretty hard for that seat. Then, this is one of the seats I put with a question mark behind it. Llanelli is stated by Plaid Cymru as a target of theirs. I think it would be, at the outer limits of what might be seen as plausible for Plaid to actually win that seat, but it is a stated target, so I thought we ought to better put it in this category. There's probably 6 seats, these ones listed here, where we wouldn't expect Labour to be mounting a serious challenge to actually take the seat. It would certainly be quite a surprise if Labour did. And then there's a number of seats which Labour have held in the reasonably recent past, or which are marginal, I think, where we could expect Labour to be competitive and possibly challenging to win. A couple of years ago, when the polls were looking really strong for Labour, they were being projected to win basically all of these seats. So those are the ones listed here: Aberconwy, blue because it's held by the Conservatives; Arfon, Cardiff Central, Cardiff North, Carmarthen East and Never, Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire, Vale, Glamorgan, and again with a question mark behind it, because I think this is sort of at the outer limits what Labour might plausibly expect to win in a very good year would be Preseli Pembrokeshire. For the Conservatives, things are perhaps slightly simpler. There's probably two seats that really ought to be safe, Monmouth and Clwyd West, both with fairly substantial margins there. There's 31 remaining seats where you wouldn't really expect the Conservatives to be seriously in the game competing to win. And then there's one seat, I think Brecon and Radnor, where the decline of Liberal Democrats would suggest that the Conservatives, who were in a strong second place last time, could well be competing to gain that. But primarily the Conservative battleground looks to be a defensive one of seeking to retain the gains that they made last time, or made previously. So Aberconwy, Cardiff North, Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire from Labour Party. Montgomery gained last time from Liberal Democrats. Vale of Glamorgan gained last time from Labour, and Preseli Pembrokeshire again, with a question mark behind it, gained in 2005 from Labour. For the Liberal Democrats, things are simpler again. There are no safe Liberal Democrat seats in Wales, I think, at the moment. There are just degrees of marginality. And there were probably 36 seats where, even though in some of them the Liberal Democrats put in a very strong performance last time, even the Liberal Democrats are not suggesting that they're going to be seriously in the game in 2015. There's one seat which they have talked up as a possible target seat, Montgomery. No longer cursed by Lembit. They think they may have some sort of chance there. Other than that, it's a defensive game, seeking to retain 3 seats. And 3 seats, you might notice, that are being attacked from 3 different directions. Brecon and Radnor, defending from the Conservatives, Cardiff Central, defending from Labour, Ceredigion, defending against Plaid Cymru. Finally, Plaid then, hold 3 seats. Dyfr Meirionnydd would be, I think, a fairly big surprise if that was lost by Plaid Cymru. And then there's 5 remaining seats. 2 that they hold, which conceivably, well, Arfon looks on paper pretty marginal, Carmarthen East a bit less so, but the Labour Party have occasionally talked up their possibilities of gaining one or both of those. And 3 potential target seats. Ynys clearly, Ceredigion, which on paper looks a big margin to bridge, but collapse in Liberal Democrat support may make that much more competitive, and at the outer bounds of possibility maybe Llanelli. Whereas in the 34 remaining seats, you wouldn't really expect Plaid Cymru to be seriously challenging. It would certainly be quite a major shock if they were. So, who's going to win these? Well, I'm not going to be putting up my own personal predictions and margins of victory and everything like that. But there's a couple of different sources. The most recent Welsh poll, the most recent March Welsh Political Barometer, if we project that, what does that say in terms of who wins which seats? The other sources, of course, we have is the 5 Ashcroft constituency polls. So in the following slides, basically I'll put a seat in bold if a party is projected to win it from the national polls under uniform national swing, and it's underlined if a party is projected to win it by the most recent Ashcroft constituency poll. And obviously if it's in bold and underlined, well, you can work that out for yourselves. So Labour. The polls would currently suggest, if we project them across Wales, that Labour will hold their apparently uncompetitive, safe seats, all 24 of them, and that they will hold both Ynys Môn and Llanelli. We haven't had constituency polls in either of them, so that's all we have to go on at the moment. They also suggest that Cardiff Central and Cardiff North, both the most recent national poll and the Ashcroft constituency polls, have suggested that Labour are likely to gain those 2 seats. But Ashcroft polls, both in Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire and in the Vale, have had Labour falling short, and a projection of the current national polls also has Labour falling short in these other seats. For the Conservatives, the polls currently suggest that most of their defensive battle will be successful. Not only should they retain their current safe seats, but they should, according to the national polls, retain all of their defending seats except for Cardiff North. And the most recent Welsh Barometer poll would project them to win narrowly Brecon and Radnor. However, Ashcroft did not project them to win that. He did, though, project them to win, or put them ahead at least, in both of these two seats, Carmarthen West, South Pembrokeshire, and the Vale. For the Liberal Democrats, well, Liberal Democrats in good news, shock. Uniform projection of the latest poll does put them, albeit somewhat narrowly ahead in Ceredigion. Lord Ashcroft put them ahead in Brecon and Radnor. But both the national polls and Ashcroft have put them behind in Cardiff Central, and the current national polls will put them some way behind also in Montgomery. And finally, Plaid. At the moment, we've had no constituency polls in Plaid target seats. The national polls currently project that Plaid will keep what they have, but that's it. So I think that's probably enough from me for now, and we can move into discussion.